All right, our next speaker is Dr. Tabetha Bernstein, Danis, and she is in special ed here at Kutztown, but she's here to talk to us today about genealogy.
All right. Hi, everybody. I call genealogy the history of ordinary people. So it's history through the eyes of your ancestors. And I have a very complex background, so it was really interesting for me. My parents met in New York, where people from all over the world come together. And that will definitely show as I share a little bit about how I learned about my family and my ancestors today with all of you. All right, so I call this, I start with the grandparents and parent approach, right? So I was very fortunate that I knew all of my grandparents. I had all 4 of them until I was 16 and 3 of them until I was in my 30s. So you start with the stories that you know from your family, from your parents, from your grandparents. And that's going to be your jumping off place. And I've been actually really into doing genealogy since I was about 16. But I didn't have access to all of these fantastic tools that we now have access to. So you have to know how to use the right tools. That's our next step. You know the stories from your family. One of my favorite resources is Family Search because it's, favorite word, free. You don't have to pay any money, no subscription fee, and they have tons of records. It's run by the Mormon Church, but anybody can use it. They have free classes, webinars. So for most things, I was able to find lots on Family Search, but I did need to use specialized databases for the Jewish side of my family, where they didn't have, as you might imagine, Catholic Church records were a big thing on Family Search. I did use DNA. My parents both did 23andMe, and so DNA is helpful for corroborating some of those family stories, and also identifying things like, for example, in my family, like in many Latino families, we identified as mestizo. We thought we were a mix of indigenous and Spanish. We're actually a mix of indigenous, Spanish, and African. And we found that out from doing the DNA. My father also, my Jewish side of the family, my grandmother always said no matter where they were from, they were the same people, and that showed up too because my father came out as 100% Ashkenazi Jewish. So that helped to corroborate some of the stories that the family told and discover some of the stories the family didn't tell. So it can be helpful in that sense. So here, my grandparents from my mom's side, I knew, like I said, I knew my grandparents very well. I knew all of their stories, and I knew exactly where they were from. So I knew my grandmother came from the mountains of Puerto Rico and Utuado. I knew she moved in the 1940s. I knew my grandfather came from Honduras, and that he immigrated in the 1940s with his brother. On my dad's side of the family, these are my dad's parents. I knew they were both born in New York, and that their families had come from the Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Austria area at the turn of the 20th century. So my family must have seen the writing on the wall. They avoided the Holocaust and were here about 30 to 40 years before that happened. And my grandma Sylvia was a prolific writer. She wrote a lot of the family history. I was very fortunate to have the stories that she wrote. So this is one of the ways you can start to corroborate some of the stories in your family by actually finding documents online. Family Search led me to the death record of my great-grandfather, my grandfather's father, who we know had been murdered when my grandfather was a child, and I actually found the record there of his murder. And so it's a sad story. My grandfather was actually, it turns out, only 5 and a half when his father died. He always told the story that he was 8, and as it turns out, he was actually only 5. A lot of people who had tragic things happen remember that trauma as being around 8. So the other thing is, sometimes the church records are very helpful, sometimes they actually pose a challenge. And this is a great example. My great-grandparents, that looks like a wedding picture to you. I think it is. Both my grandfather and his brother had that picture, but they're listed as hijos naturales in their baptismal records. And that's indicating, even though my great-grandparents tried to give them my grandfather's last name, it was not added legally. And probably that's because their marriage took place outside of the Catholic Church. So I started going backwards, and that's my great-great-grandmother. That's my grandma Mercedes' mother. I was able to trace back all the way to my 5th great-grandmother in Honduras. But I had a lot of trouble finding the father's names because they were all listed as hijos naturales, basically as illegitimate children. And so, like my great-grandmother, I only found her father's name, Binamlo Paon, a name that we didn't know before because it was in her death record. Both her parents were listed in her death record. So using church records are a lot more helpful when the parents or your grandparents were legally married, or married in the church. So for my Puerto Rican family, since they were very connected with the Catholic Church, everything happened through the Catholic Church, it was a lot easier to find a lot of their records. And those are my great-grandparents in Puerto Rico, and I was able to find their 1902 marriage record, which is pretty cool. And so there's my grandmother with one of her brothers and sisters and her mom. I was able to document and find records if you are able to use census records. It's really helpful. Puerto Rico is part of the United States, so I was able to use census records and draft records to trace all of the families and the children. So interestingly, my grandmother was the youngest of 12, and both her parents were the youngest children from these very large families out in the mountains. So another thing that can be kind of challenging is name confusion. Sometimes people are listed by their middle names. Sometimes names are spelled differently. And I ran into this a lot, especially with the Jewish side of my family, where sometimes people had a legal name and a Jewish name. So that's my great-grandmother Toba. I knew her as Toba. Her names are alternately listed as Toba, Tilly, Tella, and Teresa. So you can imagine that can get very challenging. I also found for my great-grandmother on my grandfather's side, my paternal grandfather's side, her name is listed as Lena, but we always knew her as Leah. So it might have been that Lena seemed like a less obviously Jewish name, and so that was her legal name. So you need to be very careful when you're using these tools. Be careful, especially if you're on Family Search, not to merge people if you're not absolutely sure it's the same person. But this is a great way to collaborate with your family. I'm getting calls from family members, and people are really excited about everything that I've learned and documented. And take advantage, especially Family Search, a great free tool. Thank you.